All right, so now with these last 20 minutes, let's talk about this introduction that I've been reading to you. Let me give some conclusions to this part, and then we're poised. I'll scroll down and show you. We're poised to begin a verse-by-verse eschatological essay, part 1 of verses 1 through 28 of Matthew 24. But let me just give this very short introductory conclusion. It's only one short paragraph. This is what I had to say. Matthew 24 is a chapter that has been the subject of much debate and discussion among scholars and theologians. I go on to say that while there are different interpretations of this chapter, its significance for Christians today is clear. It reminds us to be ready for Jesus' return, to be vigilant and watchful, and to focus on the things that are eternal. And I just pause and just let that part sink in. I understand that keeping your family safe during that time is important. Keeping your health safe, keeping your property safe. I mean, no one wants to have their stuff taken away. No one wants to lose the things that they've worked hard for. So I get that, right? I'm not minimizing the importance of our earthly surroundings, right? Our family relationships, our places at work, our employment, the money that we've saved up so hard, we've worked so hard for and diligently put in the bank and things like that. I'm not trying to minimize that, say that none of that's important. Those things matter, right? That they're important. But I get the sense that what Yeshua is trying to let us know is that keep your focus on things in heaven, right? He talks about how that don't store up for yourself treasures here on earth where the moth and the rust corrupts and where the thieves break in and they steal those things. And then he says, instead, store up your treasure in heaven where there's no moth, there's no corruption of rust, and there are no thieves that break through and steal. Then he concludes by saying, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Right, and then there's another passage that kind of correlates with that talks about where your treasures, that your heart will be also. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So we have to examine our heart and ask ourselves, what is most important? And for Yeshua, he wants us to be watchful and to focus on the things that are eternal. So we've got to get our priorities straight. We've got to get our house in order. Yes. Protect your family. Yes. Protect the things that you have, I don't know, I want to say built up or cherished or things. That's fine, but just realize that, you know what? A lot of that's disposable. A lot of that is just going to pass away. It's wood, hay, and stubble. What are the gold and silver and precious stones that you've built up in your life, right? The works that you've done for God. That's what we need to be mindful of as these end days are upon us. And I finally, in my final sentence, I simply say, as we await his coming, let us live our lives in a way that honors him and brings glory to his name. And I'll flash this on the screen and post. It's that quote from the late Christian pastor Leonard Ravenhill that reads something along lines of, is the life you're living for worth Christ dying for? Right? Such a powerful quote that reminds us to get our priorities straight. I'll read it one more time. It should be on your screen by now. Is the life you're living for worth Christ dying for? Something like that. Yeah, think about that. All right, so we've got about 15 minutes left. Let's begin to peel back this particular verse-by-verse essay that I put together. This is not a deep dive. I wrote this, like I said, over 20 years ago. And I simply introduced the verse quickly. I'm reading from the NASB version of the Bible when I made these quotes, and I introduce the verse, and then I just give a short kind of statement, summary, overview of what's happening in that verse. I did this with the anticipation that I was going to teach the class live, which I did, and I wouldn't have a lot of time, which I didn't. I only had 1 week for each of those 14 topics that you see on the in this particular schedule that I'm showing, which has grown to 18. It originally was only 14 because the original studies were only 14 weeks long. So that's why this study looks the way it does. But now that I'm teaching it on my YouTube channel, I have a chance to stop and kind of elaborate on more on each verse. All right, so let's jump into this verse by verse essay that I put together. Here's what I have to say. The 24th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew stands as a pivotal discourse within the New Testament, recognized for its eschatological themes and prophecies. And it really is unique. You've got to read it, but like I have recommended and continue to recommend, go back and do your Old Testament homework first, right? Go back and read Daniel, and then also go back and read certain prophecies out of the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, Zechariah, other prophecies that are definitely end times themed. And so you can be prepared so that when you finally read through Matthew, you already have the sense of Jesus is pulling information that the disciples would have been aware of if they had been faithful synagogue-going Jewish boys and had paid attention to the sermons, right? The messages that the rabbis were teaching from the Old Testament. And then Yeshua's filling in with these details. And then when he finally gives the revelation to John in the book of Revelation, we have the final detail for us to really appreciate what the end time prophecies were speaking about. So let's keep reading this. I talk about how that spanning from verses 1 to 28 for the first half of this eschatological essay, this passage unveils a series of teachings by Jesus that address the future tribulations, the signs of the end times. And remember, Yeshua specifically told his disciples, I'm telling you these things in advance so that you will have an understanding. He wasn't just giving all of these details so that we would be completely in the dark. I know there are some Christian pastors and Bible students who get the impression that because Jesus talks about his return being like a thief in the night, that why study all the details? Because no one's going to know what's going to happen, right? They kind of take into to an extreme the passages that talk about returning like a thief in the night and the no one can know the day or the hour. So they kind of run with that in a kind of an overstatement, a hyperbole fashion, and say, well, why study? Why even try to figure out what's going on when Jesus clearly told us it'll be like a thief in the night? And they're failing to understand the broader context. The thief in the night analogy is largely for the world the world in general. The thief in the night, they will not know that the master came and is returning and snatches one away, and one is taken and one is left for judgment, using the words that we're going to read about in Matthew. And that even though we Christians are being told in advance that he is going to return, yet we don't know the day or the hour, right? No one knows. The angels don't know. The Son doesn't know. Only the Father knows. So there is some sense of we don't have the exact day when it's going to happen, but Yeshua over and over again tells his disciples, I'm telling you this in advance so that you can be aware of that these are the end times, that my approach is near, and he even gives the analogy about, to read how to read the sky to know when the storm's approaching, and you can look at trees and know when it's going to be spring because of the leaves and the fruit and things like that. So he gives us those pictures so that we can get the sense that we need to live our lives with this expectancy based on the signs that are ramping up around us. So that's why I'm talking about the expectancy of the hour. Yes, there will be surprise for most of the world, but we should not be taken by surprise. And the reason I can state this confidently is because what we're going to read about in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, he specifically tells us, no, you're not children of the darkness because of your position in Messiah. Let's keep reading. So we've got these passages unveil these teachings by our Lord about the future tribulations, the signs of the end times, and the ultimate return of Christ. That's the baby that's being born by the end of the age, indicated by what we call the birth pangs, which are the first the seals that lead into the trumpet judgments, which lead into the bowl judgments, which culminate with the return of Christ. That's basically what goes on. So I go on to say, in this essay, we will undertake a verse-by-verse analysis of Matthew 24, 1 through 28, utilizing the New American Standard Bible, NASB, for scriptural references while engaging in exegesis and critical reflection. I wish it were more than this. Obviously, in fact, I even have them bookmarked. Let me just show this to you. And I think I put this in the notes, the show notes, the description underneath each video. Matthew 24, Jesus, Olivet Discourse by Enduring Word, a website that is owned and operated by Pastor David Guzik, Guzik. He is a Christian, and he outlines his understanding of Jesus, Olivet Discourse. I believe, if I remember when I read this, I haven't read it in a while, but I do recommend it because of the overall nutritional value, the spiritual value, the details that you will find. I believe, if I remember, he's a pre-tribulationist, meaning he believes that the church will be raptured prior to any tribulation, and he holds to what we would normally identify as a 7-year tribulation. I do not hold to a 7-year tribulation. I am not a pre-tribulational rapturist. I don't believe in a pre-trib rapture. But I believe Pastor Guzik does, but that doesn't change the fact that the details that he shares with us in his notes here are not beneficial, and so I recommended them. I put them in my description, so avail yourself of that link as well. But let's go back to my own. So we've got verse 1. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And I just simply comment again, this is one short verse. This verse establishes the setting for Jesus' discourse. That's why it's called the Olivet Discourse. Departing from the temple, the disciples draw Jesus' attention to the grandeur of the temple, the grandeur of the temple buildings, right? Look at the stones, look at the gold, look at the tapestry. However, I say, this seemingly innocuous observation provides a seg for Jesus to delve into the prophetic revelations concerning the temple's future. And so if you remember from this kind of analogy that I gave last week, if you want to understand the focal point of God's dealings with humanity, then you need to look at Israel, because the Bible is Israel-centric. And so of all the nations of the earth, Israel is the epicenter of God's attention when it comes to his dealings with humans. To understand God's plan and program, watch Israel. But then within Israel, as we continue to zoom in, if you want to understand even further God's dealings with mankind through Israel, then you need to zoom in on Jerusalem. So we've zoomed in from all the nations into Israel, and then we've zoomed in from Israel into Jerusalem. But it keeps going further. If you want to even better understand God's dealings with humanity through Israel, through Jerusalem, you need to zoom in on the temple. So that's where we stop there. I mean, some other people could probably keep zooming in further and say, well, if you want to look at the temple, then you got to look at the Holy of Holies or something like that, because that's the center piece of the temple. And that's true to some extent. I'm only trying to get you to understand that. Look at Israel, zoom in on Jerusalem. Look at Jerusalem, zoom in on the temple. And so this is no wonder why, when Yeshua is having this discussion with his disciples, that they're talking about the temple. They're gazing at the temple, which is a perfect chance for Yeshua to say, yeah, you see that temple? Let's talk about that temple and what's going to happen in the end of the age. So now let's look at verse 2. Sorry for keep clearing my throat there. I just had some tickle there. Verse 2, Yeshua says, and he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. At this point, I believe it's fair to recognize that Yeshua he's going to start revealing details that will happen, that will befall Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. So keep that in mind. We can verify this by reading the parallel account in Luke. That's a great place to get your parallel 70 AD details there. Luke chapter 17, and then jump over to chapter 21 after you read 17. Skip the chapters in the middle for a moment. So what happens is Yeshua starts detailing the destruction of the temple, the besiege of Jerusalem, and the events surrounding the persecution and the fleeing out of Jerusalem, fleeing into Judea, etc., etc. But what happens is, as he's talking and giving all these details, Now that we live in the 21st century and we can look backwards and use history as our guide, we can realize that 70 AD was indeed perhaps even one of the primary focal points of his details, but all of the events that Yeshua described were not exhausted at the 70 AD event where the temple was destroyed. Indeed, some of those events got carried over into the 130s with the destruction of Jerusalem and the plowing under of Jerusalem and the renaming of it to Aelia Capitolina. The expulsion of the Jews, finally, as they made one last ditch effort to overthrow Rome and its occupation, and it failed. And that was during the times of Bar Kokhba and the revolt, etc., etc. And finally, Rome said, "That's it. Get out." Right? Get out. Jerusalem is just going to be decimated. And so the temple was already destroyed long before then, and now it was just a matter of time, and the west of Jerusalem was just plowed under. So what Yeshua is detailing is mostly, as I understand, he's getting his disciples to understand that there's going to come events that in your lifetime are going to affect you. And so we hear this language about this generation and things like that. And so, yes, I think the preterists have some very important points to bring to the table of this eschatological discussion when we're talking about this prophecy that our master left for us. And this is important for us because of the parallels in the book of Revelation. According to the preterist position, the book of Revelation must be pulled into a chronological time that fits prior to the destruction of the temple in order for the book of Revelation to have any relevance for first century believers. So Matthew and Revelation both are written prior to 70 AD from the preterist perspective. But for those of us who are not preterists, such as myself, I'm a futurist. I believe that a lot of Matthew, Mark, and Luke have 70 AD details. And yet, by comparison, Revelation, even though it has parallels, Revelation has details that are future facing, meaning after 70 AD, and so thus I take the later date for Revelation, meaning the 90s. So you're probably thinking, well, how can that be if they parallel? How can Matthew and Revelation parallel if there's a lot of time between the two? Well, what we realize is this phenomenon that I keep flashing on the screen, I'll do it again in post, called prophetic telescoping, where we have events that describe a near-term historical event closer to the time of the speaker or the writer, such in this case, Yeshua speaking during the lifetime of his ministry in the 30s, and yet 70 AD is looming right around the corner. It's on the horizon. So that's the near-term event. So we have language that's written to address that. At the same time, the prophecy that he's talking about, the details here in Matthew, can play double duty and point to the far event that's far into the future of the prophet, right? Remember to see the little picture of the telescoping where you have on the left side of the screen, we have the prophet holding his staff looking at the first shorter mountain peak. That's the near-term event of 70 AD. And then you can see the second mountain peak on the far right of your screen, the taller one. That's the 70th week of Daniel, the far-term event, far from the prophet. So near to the prophet, far from the prophet. He sees both mountain peaks. They look identical to them. And what he cannot see from his perspective is the valley in between, which for us now represents 2,000 years or so. That's prophetic telescoping, near, far, now and not yet, Bible prophecy. So that's kind of what's going on. I believe is the best way to understand what we're reading about. How much of it is 70 AD? How much of it is later history? Sometimes it's hard to ascertain exactly. We just have to look at the details and try to draw from context. Well, let's see, all of this hasn't happened yet, so maybe it was partially fulfilled, and then it'll be repeated in the end times, sometimes with great precision. Maybe certain individuals will step right into the same historical footprints left behind by their predecessors, like when we talked about the future Antichrist mimicking events that were already historically witnessed by forerunners such as Antiochus Epiphanes, etc., things like that. All right, so we have this verse where Yeshua's talking about one stone not being left. Well, that did happen in 70 AD. So that's a good indication that part of what preterism, at least the partial version, preterism has some accurate details that we can look at and glean from their perspective of the Bible. but I'm saying this in closing, we'll probably stop here. What we also realize is that since there is no standing temple yet, if we are to allow for a near-term prophetic paralleling of the details of the destruction of the temple, like Yeshua is describing, right, one stone not left unturned, which happened in 70 AD, and yet right now there's no temple, which means if this is only partially fulfilled and will be fulfilled again in the future, what does it mean? It means there must be another temple or some other structure that perhaps will allow for the stones to be upturned again. Right? The Jews might be allowed to build an edifice, and then when the Antichrist comes in and besieges Jerusalem and takes control of the temple and ceases the sacrifices that Daniel already foretold would happen, and Paul foretells is going to happen, and Yeshua also foretells, then perhaps maybe the stones will be upturned again. We'll have something that parallels that. Either way, the most important part is that there'll be some form of device that will facilitate an altar where sacrifices can resume. That's the primary aspect, because this is the point that Paul picks up on in the letter to the Thessalonians, and we'll get to that in time, where he talks about how the Antichrist takes his seat in the temple of God and demands that everyone worship him, and that animal sacrifices are brought to a halt and things like that. So we'll get to that in time, but we'll stop here. Let me read just this last comment, this comment on the verse right here, and then we'll draw this part of our study to a close. Jesus' proclamation is profound and startling. He predicts the temple's impending destruction, right, 70 AD, foretelling an event of great magnitude. Historical records affirm that the fulfillment of this prophecy in the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. And I just mentioned that because it doesn't mean that all of the details were exhausted in 70. I am not a preterist. I do not believe that full preterism or hyper-preterism is beneficial. Indeed, it borders on heretical. Partial preterism, though, does bring some beneficial points for us to consider, even if you're a non-preterist. So that'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events.